There you go.
Okay, great. Well, let me get the ball rolling here. My name is Miguel Schor, and I'm going to briefly introduce the panel and the panelists. This is the demise of American exceptionalism, question mark, right? The Trump presidency in comparative and historical perspective. The panelists, and this is the order they're going to go in, Mark Graber, who's the University of Maryland Regents Professor of Law. Kim Lane Scheppele will present along with David Pozen. She is the Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton. David is the Charles Keller Beekman Professor of Law. I will go third. I teach at Drake University. And last will be Ralf Michaels, the director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Private Law in Hamburg, as well as the Global Law Professor at Queen Mary. I want to thank each of these panelists for agreeing to be here. And also, when it was accepted, I want to thank the organizers for accepting this proposal. And when it was accepted, Kim wrote to me and used my favorite line from Sesame Street when she said that this panel is not quite like the others. I think that's a fair assessment. There have been wonderful panels on history. We're obviously going to talk about the Trump presidency, but what we really also want to focus in on is, given the historical moment the United States faces, what might we learn, right, from comparative constitutionalism? So with that introduction, Mark Graber will begin.
We go from Sesame Street to You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. Because a year ago, I was asked to write a paper we've all been asked to write, because the subtitle is Peter Rabbit Was Like That Too, which is taken from You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And if you're wondering, it is someone wants to write an anthology where it turns out what the essay says about Newark is also supposed to be true of Des Moines and Sao Paulo, or in this case, right-wing populism. This is what right-wing populism does in Hungary, and lo and behold, the other essays are supposed to say, and they're basically doing the same thing in Poland, Venezuela, United States, you name it. And after a little fighting, I want to say, there were some real differences, and it struck me one difference between the constitutional manifestation of right-wing populism in the United States and elsewhere is a sense in which the United States may have been born populist in a way other countries have not. So we know from Louis Hartz's claim was on de Tocqueville, Americans born equal or born liberal. European liberals had to overcome entrenched churches and entrenched nobility, and they looked to the state to overcome those obstacles to liberalism. And so European liberals liked a good big state. American liberals didn't have an established church, didn't have an entrenched nobility, didn't need a state to overcome it. American liberals were more anti-state. And it occurred to me that one of the features of a good deal of populism is when you get into power, you have to overcome the existing constitution and the people interpreting it. Whereas for the most part, Donald Trump did not have to do that. And indeed, in Trump's hands and in right-wing populist hands, Americans engage in constitutional worship. Something Orban would certainly not do. Orban did not perhaps say, wow, that Hungarian constitution of about 1989, wow, wonderful. Chavez Madero did not say wonderful, the Constitution. They're out to fix it. And I want to explore some reasons why American populists are distinct. And one way of looking at it was through a lens of Justice Scalia, who nobody thought was a populist for many years, and in fact died before populism really begun to dominate American politics. But in fact, Scalia is the hero to right-wing populists because he gave them a lot of what they wanted. The Unitary Executive, a crucial feature of populism, is concentrating power in the executive, and Scalia in Morrison versus Olson says, all the executive power means all. If it's an executive power, the president has it, and nobody else, in particular, prosecution. In a great many countries, the way executives entrench power is by gaining control over prosecution. Scalia said, good news. You don't have to gain control over prosecution. You got control in 1787/1789 that he said, even when they're prosecuting corruption, if the people don't like the way they're prosecuting corruption, you throw the bums out. How the people know there's corruption, Scalia doesn't tell us, but one presumes that people have ways. One sees in Scalia the cultural prerequisites of right-wing populism. First, a strong anti-elitism. Scalia was constantly something. There was a law professor culture, and I know I'm going to be cut off as saying this. There is nothing more elite than law professors, even populist law professors. I annoy my students by calling them elites because they want to be lawyers, but we are. And Scalia said, it's the law professors versus the people, and we know what side we ought to be on if we are good populists. It is traditional morality that matters. It is religion. Scalia says the Establishment Clause meant monotheism. The framers believed in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Bet you didn't know the framers believed in Islam, but it's monotheistic. It's those non-monotheistic religions they wanted to kick out. Now, what is remarkable in all of this was Scalia claimed that all of this was justified by the original intentions of the framers. The U.S. was born populist, and while originalist rhetoric exists in some places, it is very rarely a staple of right-wing populism for the obvious reason in most right-wing populist jurisdictions. The Constitution was drafted only a generation before the populists took power. Everybody knew the Constitution was drafted by progressive cosmopolitanisms. If you were an originalist, there was no way you could make that work. You wanted to undo the past constitutional revolution in the name of your own. Now, one might think right-wing populists have a similar problem in the United States because, as most good historians know, if anything, the Constitution of 1787 was a rebellion against what might be called proto-populist movements of the late 18th century. At the very least, if it was elites versus the people, the framers were on the side of the elites. That's an oversimplification, but nobody thinks the framers were trying to topple an American elite. So why originalism? Well, one, the Constitution plays a role in American identity that it doesn't play in a great many other places. For Americans, the Constitution is good. It is what constitutes us. Now, other countries, the past, Hungary has a past, Venezuela has a past, to be a true Venezuelan. But to be a true Israeli is not necessarily to follow the basic law as expounded by our own Barak. It goes back beyond constitution making, whereas to be a true American is to be committed to the Constitution. Moreover, it turns out, while a newer Constitution will actually say things about contemporary facts. So, example, most newer constitutions, progressive, say there's some obligation to obey international law. Older constitutions don't say these things. They don't talk about abortion. They don't talk about affirmative action or national health care. So it's a lot easier to imagine. The framers had our positions. And by the way, one wonderful virtue of the framers is they're dead. I write a lot about 19th century American constitutional development, and I know I'm right because Abraham Lincoln has never contested me. If you're writing about the Polish constitution, you claim it's populist in a certain kind of ways, Lech Walesa is still around to say, no, you're just wrong. George Washington has never criticized Antonin Scalia or his descendants and ancestors in any way. Moreover, it turns out Americans know very little about the Constitution. So it becomes very easy to say that, for example, the framers wanted an American republic governed by Americans. They did not want our independence, our sovereignty compromised by international law. Now, you cannot possibly get a PhD, probably even in English, and make that assertion. All people with some expertise. No, in fact, the framers were committed to the international law regime. But the average American doesn't. And because the Constitution is 250 years old, it becomes easy to imagine the framers are us. After all, George Washington, we all know, was a good, fine, upstanding citizen. I'm a good, fine, upstanding citizen. So George Washington and I must have thought alike. And there's something about originalism that simply appeals to that. A second feature of being born populist is, unlike other regimes where populists first captured the government and then captured the judiciary, it's fair to say populists had a stronger toehold in 2060 in the Supreme Court, where they were one vote away from controlling than they did in any other institution. Republicans, in fact, had been engaged in a form of court packing since 1968. Now, the court packing was only partially populist. It was populist on cultural matters. It was also for executive power for reasons having very little to do with populism and everything to do with two other facts about Republicans. One, they wanted a muscular foreign policy. A muscular foreign policy is best run out of the executive branch. So they wanted a court that would let the executive run a muscular foreign policy. And they were worried about progressives and bureaucracies. They wanted a court that would let the executive control the bureaucracy. But the result was that 11 of the 15 Supreme Court appointments made before Trump took office were Republicans. Some of it was luck. Some of it also was Republicans were very clear about ideology. Democrats tempered ideology with diversity. So it's interesting, there are no movement progressives on the court. The closest to a movement progressive was Ginsburg, and her movement went mainstream long before Ginsburg sat on the court. Ginsburg, on radical feminism issues, Ginsburg didn't have much to say on the court. So what did Republicans do under Trump? What we see is a more radical form, and not even radical form, more intense form of politics as usual. Delay the Garland appointment. Now, people say you should have held hearings, but if Republicans held hearings and held firm, Garland wasn't going to be nominated anyway. Fill empty seats as soon as they become vacant. Perfectly constitutional. Encourage seniors to resign. In a different regime, after Kavanaugh broke records for most perjury statements in a Senate hearing in 5 minutes, Republicans might have said, we can find another Republican. In this climate, no. And we all know about Barrett. But the crucial feature, it's a lot easier. My apologies. Did everyone get bumped off, or was it just me?
I was too.
Yeah, everyone.
I was too.
Yep, I was bumped up as well.
Okay, the next question. Was it something I said?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, well, I was going into just a fabulous conclusion. This probably ruined everything. The first and foremost lesson, which is of the whole conference, is whenever there's a future, there's a past. I will stake my professional reputation on that. More to the point, to understand what options people have today, you need to know what happened in the past, and American right-wing populists behave differently than populists elsewhere because their past is different. The Constitution was different. The courts was different. This particularly poses a challenge for the American left because unlike the American right, the American left, if it takes power, will face a judiciary that is stacked against them. And they'll have a more complex set of choices. And indeed, one of the things I fear is the anti-populist literature has gotten very, very big on checks, on changes of any sort, in a way that I fear that no populist advance is possible if we are to check power the way it is. And maybe the better solution for progressives or on the left is rather than think hard about how to check populist power, think harder about how to mobilize and create left-wing progressive populist citizens. Thank you.
Am I up now? Okay. Can people hear me okay? I think Kim and I had the same experience of being kicked out of the Zoom. Maybe others did too.
Did the entire session go down and we all went out and back in again, or was it just us?
No, it was everyone. Everyone was
Everyone. Okay, I'm glad everyone came back.
In response to the chat, I should add, George Washington Ghost was trying to say, I want you to pause and think about what he's saying seriously. He was not taking issue with what I had to say.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts on Mark's exciting project, but I'm going to present half of my project with Kim in this part of the session. And Kim and I have written a paper on the phenomenon of what we call executive underreach in connection with the COVID-19 crisis. And we start from the observation that when lawyers think about and worry about executive responses to emergencies, they typically worry about executive overreach. And I think the Bush administration's response to 9/11 is the paradigmatic example of this. And we saw it as well when COVID-19 hit. A number of NGOs around the world quickly developed civil liberties trackers of various kinds or compilations of states of emergency, immediately focusing on the threat to civil liberties and civil rights of governments acting aggressively, perhaps over-aggressively to head off a crisis. But Kim and I want to say that there's an inverse or mirror image phenomena that should be just as worrisome, if not more so in some contexts, which is when executives fail to act with sufficient vigor or decisiveness in the face of a true threat. And we try to define executive underreach preliminarily as a national executive branch's willful failure to address a significant public problem that the executive is legally and functionally equipped, though not necessarily legally required, to address. So a significant public problem that the executive fails to address, even though it's legally and functionally equipped to do so. So as a matter of positive law, we say an underreaching executive could do more, is legally authorized to do more to head off a crisis. And as a matter of political morality, an underreaching executive should do more, given the severity of the threat and the reason for the executive having its powers in the first place. There are a lot of caveats and complications to that definition, probably not worth dwelling on here, but I'll just note that a lot of executive branch omissions and abstentions don't count as underreach per our definition. We recognize that executives must have some freedom to make mistakes and experiment with policies that may not work out. And we try to reserve the definition of underreach, which is a pejorative term that embeds a negative assessment for situations where an executive sees a threat coming, has access to information and about what might mitigate the threat and the capacity to do something about it, and then nonetheless refuses to act. So there's a prerequisite of having sufficient state capacity to do something about the problem that's not exercised. Okay, so there's a bit of a puzzle that's immediately raised by the very idea of executive underreach, which is given the incentive structure of modern executives to show results and efficacy, especially when there's a real crisis. Why would an executive ever underreach? Shouldn't all their incentives point, if anything, toward overreach, as we've seen in various national security contexts? And briefly, Kim and I say it's actually not at all strange to think that it would be rational politically for an executive to underreach under certain conditions. It might be because an executive is uninformed or even unhinged, and the American context may provide an example of that right now, but more and more pedestrian key, we just might find that bureaucratic or procedural barriers to action are sufficient to deter executives, or that executives want to shift blame and avoid responsibility for a hard problem, or they don't want to alienate key supporters who prefer inaction, or maybe their political program is built around demonizing big government and shrinking the state, or the problem may span borders and there may be serious collective action problems to one state resolving it so that it's not in the interest of any one state to act aggressively. And moreover, the incumbents may have political motivations to capitalize on the chaos that can result from underreach. So we try to frame the general issue of underreach as a plausible tactic of executives, ill-motivated and not, in real crisis situations. And then we get to the COVID context, and I won't talk about it here, but Kim is expert, of course, in Hungary, and we talk about how Orban is a paradigmatic overreacher in this moment we're in, and has exploited the crisis to aggrandize his own power. On the other hand, and more interestingly in some ways, what's happening in the U.S. Is better characterized, we say, as profound underreach, and the same goes, we say, for Brazil. So I'll say a bit by way of summary. Probably all of us on the Zoom know the basic details about how Trump is underreached, and a bit about why the American system is ill-equipped to deal with it, and turn it over to Kim. So why do we say that Trump has underreached, whereas in many other countries it's kind of hard to say exactly whether it's been underreach or overreach? And in the main, we think it's actually not the case that there's been pervasive underreach or overreach in responding to COVID. But in the US, we have Trump, well known to have demagogic and authoritarian tendencies. You might think this would be a moment in which he'd try to consolidate power before an election, demonstrate decisiveness. But in reality, his response has been anemic to COVID-19. He minimized the danger posed by it still is posed by COVID-19 as it became a public health problem early in the year. He declined to order the CDC to prioritize it. He declined to follow a national security playbook on fighting infectious diseases left for him by the Obama administration. He declined also to use statutes, longstanding statutes often used from Congress that specifically authorize presidents to do things in emergencies like this. For example, the Defense Production Act of 1950 allows presidents to order necessary supplies to be produced for national security. It's used all the time by the Defense Department, and it wasn't invoked at all until late March, and only feebly then by the Trump administration for ventilator production or PPE. Trump waited a long time to draw the national stockpile. Similarly, and I probably shouldn't go on at too much length, threatened to pull us out of the WHO, peddled dangerous and dubious cures, declined to wear a face mask himself in public for a long time, held rallies outside and inside, largely maskless, criticized governors who imposed lockdowns and the like, and so on. And in Brazil, a similar story with Bolsonaro, uncannily similar story with Bolsonaro using some of the same moves in this underreaching spirit. Bolsonaro had a great line, by the way, I'll just quote, when confronted, when the death toll there passed 5,000 by a reporter about that, he said, "So what do you want me to do?" Which we describe in the paper as the underreachers' credo or maxim. So, okay, if Trump is underreaching, what can be done about it? And we say that underreach, in addition to representing a suboptimal response to the problem at issue, almost definitionally, has serious potential longer run negative externalities on the broader constitutional system. It can deplete state capacity, it can exacerbate inequality. The very fact that it fails to respond to a significant problem tees up overreach by future administrations who then have to deal with that problem and precarity. And it can create, cross-border spillovers of various kinds. So, so we have a lot of reasons to care about underreach, and indeed to think about it as in some ways of a piece with, not the opposite of overreach, insofar as Trump and Bolsonaro actually are in some ways aligned with a leader like Orban in the way they're responding to COVID-19. Orban's been decisive, whereas they've been weak in their response, but both are calling into question the legitimacy of public health institutions, demonizing the media, rewarding political allies while going after responsible civil servants. And we suggest there's a common illiberal, anti-democratic core driving the underreach and overreach, such that it's a mistake, a conceptual mistake, to see them as totally opposite to each other. They can serve similar ends. But the US, and here I'll leave off, provides few resources to deal with overreach by an executive in a disastrous situation like we have with Trump, particularly because our constitutional text is focused on negative rights rather than positive entitlements to social provision from the state. We also have a number of judicial doctrines that make executive inaction presumptively and in practice almost categorically unreviewable by the courts. We have a decline of structural remedies from the courts as a way to get at profound problems of state failure, and just a general culture in which judges have proven unwilling and unable to stimulate more aggressive action by the political branches in the face of a crisis. So with that, I'll leave it off and turn it over to Kim.
Yeah, so just to pick up from there, this is a panel on American exceptionalism, and I think David and I both started by saying, well, in this regard, the US was not so exceptional, because you look at Trump, you look at Bolsonaro, what you were seeing was at least a certain pattern of populist leadership that resulted in just dropping the ball. Also Boris Johnson, sort of at the beginning of the pandemic. So then the question is, do all constitutional governments really come out the same? And as David said, there are very few resources in the American constitutional landscape for forcing an executive to do something that the executive is legally empowered to do. And that's where you see a real difference. And I just want to take up Brazil. And I've learned since our paper was finished, there have been some interesting kind of developments in Brazil. So while Bolsonaro was doing nothing, the courts were doing something. So we actually managed to put in our paper the fact that there was a court that actually ordered Bolsonaro to wear a mask because he was refusing to do that. But the courts got even more active after that. So one was that the courts actually ordered the national government to undertake the protection of indigenous people, gave them a deadline, told them things they had to do because the indigenous population in Brazil was really badly hit. The other thing was that the Federal Supreme Court of Brazil ordered the government to publish COVID data about where the outbreaks were happening so that local officials could actually take over. There was a local court that actually ordered a lockdown in a province. And then on the private law side, there was actually the federal Supreme Court actually ordered a meatpacking plant to put into effect social distancing in a meatpacking plant in lieu of any government regulation. So what you see in Brazil, and actually in a number of other systems, since Ralf is our commentator, I'll just mention it didn't really come about on COVID, but the Federal Constitutional Court doesn't hesitate to tell the government of Germany that it must do things. The most controversial case of the summer was not a COVID case, but was this so-called Weiss case, or the PSPP case, where the Federal Constitutional Court basically said the German government had to withdraw from the European Central Bank unless it was satisfied, unless it got information that showed how the central bank had made its decisions with regard to state debt purchases and so on. So that was sort of a positive order of the government to do something. So in a lot of other countries, courts have taken the responsibility for ordering governments to act where there's a void. And the US courts have actually not done that. So to say that the US is exceptional is in some ways to run up against another image the US has of itself, which is not only that it's exceptional, but critics of US courts, which include many law professors, of course, say that the problem is that US courts are too powerful, that they're too aggressive, that they act where they shouldn't. There has been, at least until now, we'll see what happens with a much solider majority on the US Supreme Court if that happens. That court should stay out of things, that they're not well positioned to do things. Well, it turns out that US courts, even at their most activist, are much less activist than courts are in other countries, and much less willing to rise to the challenge of actually ordering executives who have the power to fix something that they really should be fixing to actually go ahead and do that. So I think in some ways this turns the American image of itself on its head a bit. The courts are less powerful and less easily activated than they are in other countries. And so as a result, underreach is actually really a structural problem in the US more than it is in other places. And so I'll just end with, actually, David and I wrote two papers. So one is coming out in the American Journal of International Law, another's coming out in an edited volume that Paul Kahn and Miguel Maduro wrote, or that edited. And in this second paper, one of the things we do is we look back to Hannah Arendt's account in On Revolution of why the American Constitution was created. And she said, well, of course, the first thing it was sort of interest to the framers to, go back to the framers where Marx started, is that they wanted to, create a government that was a government of limited power. But the other is that they wanted to create a government of power. They wanted to be able to encourage it to do something. And so empowering a federal government, standing up a federal government that would actually be able to act, was also another concern. And I might add, since we finished our paper, something else, I've just read a draft paper by Jonathan, I think it's Gnisap, who's at Stanford, who's been looking now at some of the work around the construction of the US constitutional preamble and the ideas of both Wilson and Morris at the convention, arguing that actually what the preamble was meant to do, if you look at what they had hoped for it, was to provide actually a blueprint for state action and empowerment of the US government. So I wonder, in our exceptional moment, and now that Mark has invoked the framers, that we can actually start to think about ways of using originalism for empowering the state to act where it should. Okay, all of that is in an ideal world that we don't actually live in. So we may be careful what we wish for. So I might end right there. Thanks.
Miguel, you have to unmute.
All right, David, thank you for that. Thank you for that help there. I've been booted around 5 times. We'll see how this goes. So following the 2016 election and the rise of populism around the globe, a tsunami of literature came out talking about democratic breakdown, democratic erosion. And I have a really basic, just comparative question, which is this. In what ways are the problems the US faces like those of other democracies, and how are they different, right? And my argument is that the Trump presidency is a gift. It's a gift to constitutionalists. because they can watch the erosion of a long-standing wealthy democracy. That's unusual. That's exceptional, right? And in particular, Trumpism is a challenge to three sort of political constitutionalist orthodoxies. The first, that wealthy long-standing democracies are immune to breakdown and they should resist erosion, right? The second, that presidentialism has worked well in the United States, although it has largely been a failure elsewhere where it has been tried. And third, that constitutionalism, right? The idea that you need sort of written documents to protect against democratic excess, right? Well, let me take them in order. So the first one, right, democracy and wealth. I mean, I think that's it's fairly self-evident, right? I mean, wealthy democracies have a reservoir of legitimacy, right? If you practice democracy for a long time, you have a lot of buy-in from it. These are Superman democracies, right? And it was not that long ago that scholars were actually optimistic about democracy, right? The year was 1989. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And you had a whole bunch of literature coming out saying how democracy was going to beat out authoritarianism. And there were good reasons, right, for that optimism. They're normatively attractive. And very importantly, democracies are good at muddling through crises, right? Today, of course, scholars are pessimistic about it. And they point to exogenous shocks, right? Globalization, climate change, illegal immigration, the information technology. And by the way, if these four aren't enough, we now have a pandemic as well, right? And of all of these shocks, I think the new information technologies are the most worrisome. I think when the history of this era is written, 1991 will end up being a more important year than 1989. 1991 was the year that web servers first became available, right? And so I think the question that we're faced with is that that when democracies went through crises in the past, they had a working marketplace of ideas. That may not be true today, right? That in particular, right? I mean, so here's two problems, right, with new information technologies. One, they facilitate the spread of falsehood, right? By getting rid of information gatekeepers, right? Everyone is a reporter now. Nobody wants to pay for the news. They also facilitate polarization. I think one of the most interesting backdoors or phenomena about the Trump presidency is how little the polls have moved. People are really stuck in their opinions, no matter what's being said, because the way they get their news from these sort of polarized sources. When scholars were optimistic, right, about democracy, they divided the world's democracy into two categories, right? So one were democracies with adjectives or flawed democracies. These were located primarily in the developing world. And then in the other category, right, found primarily in the developed world, were consolidated democracies, right? They had elections, they had robust institutions, right? And what I think is interesting is the way that speech has sort of shrunk the distance between flawed democracies and consolidated democracies, at least if the United States has anything to teach the world, by which I mean the following. What do flawed democracies have in common? Well, loyalty to the elected leader replaces loyalty to institutions. Clientelist policies are used as a way to buy votes. Emergencies, right, become normalized. Election rules, right, are manipulated. And so speech has become a sort of a kryptonite in some ways for long-standing wealthy democracies. Okay. What about my next two orthodoxies, which are presidentialism and constitutionalism? Let me introduce them for two things. One of which is these are two dimensions along which the United States differs a lot from other democracies, right? So that's the first thing. Secondly, the framers were like really concerned about democratic breakdown as well. They used different terminologies, right? They talked about demagogues, they talked about the tyranny of the majority, but those map out nicely to these two different categories as well. So let me start with presidentialism. I mean, the orthodoxy is the following, is that it has largely been a failure everywhere other than in the United States, right? If you look at their 22 countries that have been democratic since 1950, only one other country, that's Costa Rica, has been successful with that. If you go back one year to 1949, right, we stand alone there. So there's sort of two differing accounts of how tyranny emerges. One is constitutionalist, right, or institutionalist, and that's James Madison, right, talking about how you put all the powers in the hands of one person, you have tyranny. And on that, what we have to worry about are evolutionary changes in the presidency, right? The growth of domestic powers following the New Deal, the growth of the national security state following the Second World War, and emergency, right, and delegation of the problems. On this account, right, Trump is just a lucky beneficiary of long-term changes. There is another account which relies not on formal institutions, but informal ones, right? And the British constitutionalists really pioneered the idea that informal norms really matter. They call them conventions in sustaining democracy. The political scientists, right, Lebowski and Ziblatt, they're a great piece talking about how mutual toleration, right, and forbearance really matter. I call these democracy-sustaining norms. I think it's another way of thinking about them, which is that you really want to elect the leaders who are willing to compromise and who are really willing to accept their opponents as being legitimate. The bottom line is that polarization is associated, right, with democratic breakdown. So here's what I want to do. I think we need to have ways to think about how to combine these two different accounts. We need to have ways to thinking about how institutions play a role in the emergence, right, or the destruction of these democracy-sustaining norms. And my point of departure is actually a very famous essay by Juan Lins called "The Perils of Presidentialism," where his was an institutional account, right? He said, look, that the problem with separation of powers is that it leads to conflict between Congress and the president. Over time, the presidents emerge with too much power. I want to make a different argument. I want to reboot Juan Lins and make the following claim, that the problem with presidentialism is that there are too many pathways that actors can use to destroy these norms, and that on balance, parliamentary governments do a better job of sustaining them. I'm going to try to substantiate that's a big claim, obviously, with the following two arguments. The first has to do with the following, which is that presidentialism opens the door to political candidates who are short on political experience, but long on media exposure. And that's a problem, right? Because the relationship between parties and presidents may be purely opportunistic, right? It's within a party that one learns things like accepting the opponents or the importance of elections. In fact, one of the very, very few times Republican Party actually stood up to Donald Trump was when he said that he could move, right, the election date, right? Whereas in parliamentary systems, peer review, right, by the political class tends to play a larger role in selecting those candidates. And that's actually quite helpful in weeding out unfit outsiders, right, from office. The other reason why I think it does a better job has to do with the really big difference, right, between parliamentary and presidential government is, of course, that parliamentary government is very efficient. Presidential government is not. Because of all those veto points, that means many more actors can play a role in sort of destroying these kinds of norms. We need to welcome into the club not only Donald Trump, but also Mitch McConnell and what he's done with Supreme Court nominations. Whereas with parliamentary governments, that efficiency is actually, think about this, right? When we're talking about these informal norms, these democracy-sustaining norms, courts don't really enforce them. I mean, they come in once or twice, but they really don't. The political actors have to find in their self-interest, rightly, to effectuate them. This is where parliamentary government is useful because the efficiency facilitates, right, the logic of mutually assured destruction. That if you're a parliamentary leader, you may have to worry about the fact that if you lose an election, your opponent may turn a table. I think what's also useful here is another feature that you find in a great many parliamentary governments is that they separate out a head of government from a head of state. The head of government does the actual work. The head of state does the ceremonial work. But what's useful there is that they can be pressed into service to be kind of an honest broker, right? They're above politics when there's a dispute between the parties. They can also speak to the better angels of our nature, right? One example, of course, would be the Queen when she gave her speech for the pandemic. That's presidentialism. What about constitutionalism, right? That's the basic idea that the people are a danger, right? And their power needs to be limited in some fashion by the name of a written document or written documents. And I think the globalist populist eruption is suggesting that this long relationship, right, between documents and citizens may be coming to a very messy divorce. I think it's useful to think about this in terms of a spectrum, right? So one of the spectrum would be a purely political constitution where the only real limit on elected officials are conventions, right? That's sort of the classical view of the British Constitution. Somewhere in the messy middle are the vast majority of the world's democracies. They have written bills of rights, they have courts as well. And then you have some polities that rely on stronger medicine. And the United States is the best example of that. Why? Well, I think right, Madison again says it best, right? He was worried about the tyranny of the majority. Although one thing we need to keep in mind is that it's not that they had any real experience on mass democracy or the way that the democratic majorities might use the tools of representative democracy to destroy that, right? So this was based much more on fears than actual experience. When I say that it's exceptional democratic, what are the features of this order? Would be the following, right? One of which is you have a political class that can entrench us on the power, be it gerrymandering or voter restrictions, right? You have strong bicameralism with malapportionment in the Senate. You have electoral college. You've got a Supreme Court that is largely very weak in terms of checks and balances on it, right? And you have a constitution that's very difficult to amend. I think it's useful here to contrast also in many ways the American constitution with the German by the following. So the German, those who drafted the basic law were worried about democratic breakdown as well. And they made sure that the important democratic elements of that constitution could never be amended out of existence via the eternity clause. We sort of have the exact opposite, right? So all of the undemocratic elements are effectively in an eternity clause. One quite literally, which is of course the Senate, but all the other elements are played by politics. They're very difficult to change. So we have our own version of that eternity complex. So look, there's some payoff to complexity, right? It's lasted a long time, right? It's arguably blunted Trump's attempt to obtain power as well. I think it's leading today to a severe problem in democratic legitimacy, right? You see it not only in the protests that you see in the streets, because we haven't effectuated the promise of equality. You see it in the 2016 election when you think about how many citizens wanted real substantial change. They voted for it either in the form of Donald Trump in the general or Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. And you're seeing it in the 2020 election where they had a Pew poll showing that 90% of Trump's voters think that Biden is a real threat to America, and vice versa, right? Where the Biden voters feel the same way about Donald Trump. So here's the last point I want you to think about is this. Democratic emergence, right, in the late 18th century, early 19th centuries, was linked with providing security for elites, right? They gave up some power in exchange for institutions to protect their interests. It may be the case that democratic continuance in the 21st is linked to providing security for ordinary citizens as well. I mean, this is Franklin Roosevelt's point, right? In his 1944 State of the Union, where he said that we needed a second Bill of Rights. And his argument was that the antidote to demagogues, right, was providing security for ordinary citizens, jobs, housing, healthcare, right? All of those that we're seeing lacking for so many people, right, in the pandemic. It's as if the North Atlantic world is running a national experiment, right, between the virtues of efficient versus inefficient government. The efficient governments of Western Europe not only provide these kinds of positive rights, they've also done a very different job dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic, right? They protected jobs. We have protected business interests. And so the stock market's doing great. Ordinary citizens were not doing that well at all. So what are my conclusions? Two, basically. One, I think the democratic pessimist argument is somewhat overblown, that democracies have a fine long-term track record in dealing with crises. That's a reason to be guardedly optimistic as to where we're going. That said, right, new information technologies are a different kind of threat than they have faced in the past. And lastly, I think the last point is the following, that although all democracies are facing headwinds, they're blowing harder here in the United States than they are abroad for two reasons, right? One of which is that personal governments are rather rich in avenues that these sort of democracy norms can be destroyed. Parliamentary governments do better on this. And lastly is the following, that when a polity like the United States relies on an exceptional number of veto points, right, that prevents citizens from getting the kinds of outputs they want, they may well turn to a demagogue, right, to someone who can promise to cure all the nation's problems as a solution, to the nation's ills. So, thank you. So, up to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Miguel. I guess I'm up. I have a bunch of completely illegible notes, so I'll see how I get through those. We live in very fortunate times for comparative lawyers, at least in one way, because the pandemic, terrible as it is in very many other ways, is a fabulous testing point for comparative lawyers, of course. That is, we have really separate case studies at the moment with a diversity of policies on the one hand, and a diversity of outcomes on the other. And we have what we rarely have as comparative lawyers, relatively good separation of the case studies, simply because we have travel bans. And so it seems indeed to be the case that policy effects that are national really remain within national boundaries. That is really, for comparative lawyers who are willing to take that up, a very unusual and unusually promising situation to do meaningful comparative law. When we see numbers and when we see combinations, we learn a number of things. We learn, First, that the early idea of a trade-off between economy and saving lives has become a myth, because if we look at numbers, it turns out that by and large, those that save the most lives are also the ones that do best in the economy. And second, we see that in some cases like Sweden, some lives are sacrificed, but to no benefit compared to neighboring countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, all of which have exactly the same effects on the economy with more lives saved. So that's the first thing we learn. Second thing that we learn is that we seem to have regional differences, where East Asia is doing very well, where Latin America is doing very badly, where Africa is doing surprisingly well, and where the European countries, some are doing well, some are doing badly. And the United States, of course, as we know, is doing badly, but at least in overall comparison, is not doing catastrophically badly. It's doing about as badly as the UK and Spain in some numbers, etc. The focus, of course, in much of our debate, at least as I see from Germany, is almost exclusively, as it is in almost every question, is the United States. So what we follow in Germany, and I'm sure that's true for many other countries as well, the UK perhaps accepted, is first our own country, and second, the United States. So we follow day by day the craziness of Trump, whether he wears a mask or not. We see the numbers in the US, we take them to be exceptional numbers. We think that the catastrophe is only in the United States and not anywhere else. And so that is something that seems to me quite typical of our response, not just in the United States, but also in the rest of the world, to have a disproportionate focus on the United States. So if we wanted to get a first understanding of what exceptionalism is, both US exceptionalism and Trump's exceptionalism, it's that everyone focuses on the US and Trump and not so much on others at all. And to some extent, of course, this panel does the same, because we take as our starting point Trump, we take as our starting point the United States. We say we do so comparatively, and indeed we do, but of course our main focus remains a starting point and end point, and the focus of most of the three presentations remains in the United States. And that, of course, has advantages and it has disadvantages. So let me say a bit about exceptionalism. Let me say a bit about each of the three presentations and give each of the presenters a question with the answer that I would give, but that they may not give, and then finish and open up for general discussion. I already have one question from Tim Sellers through the chat, and I'd ask others who have questions not to wait until I'm done, but just to formulate, to point that out in the chat function, and I'll call on you then when time allows. So exceptionalism, of course, US exceptionalism and Trump exceptionalism are not necessarily the same thing. As for US exceptionalism, first, I think I learned most clearly what that meant when Tom Ginsburg, who's not here at the moment, I think, came to give a talk at my former law school at Duke and compared some 60 constitutions in the world, US Constitution included. And my faculty, which is not more, no less comparative than most others in the country, rebelled almost because it seemed incredible to them that Tom would just place the US somewhere within these 60 constitutions, because he was not paying attention to the peculiarities of the United States. He did not actually see that the US was exceptional. And of course, I would think that, I hope Tom said that, the US is exceptional in the same way in which every country is exceptional, right? Every country is exceptional, every country's details have to be passed over for such a comparison. If there is something specific about US exceptionalism, then it is that it is constantly mentioned all the time. The idea, I think, comes from Tocqueville, who points out that the US is exceptional, who was the first foreigner to whom Americans listened about their constitution. He was also the last, of course. And in that sense, a lot of talk of US exceptionalism still goes back to the framers. At the time, of course, the US was exceptional. But I think today we'd have to see more how it is exceptional. We'd have to show it more, but mostly we don't show it, we just presume it. I was struck, and just as an example, in the hearings of Amy Coney Barrett, lots of you were struck by lots of things. I was struck that she says she speaks no foreign language. And so we are going to, or you are, not me anymore, you are going to get a US Supreme Court justice, another one, who in this case, unlike her mentor Scalia, who was a comparative lawyer, who taught comparative law, will be absolutely unknowledgeable about the rest of the world, and indeed probably also international law. That's the one thing. US exceptionalism is more taken as an a priori and as the result of a comparison, which it would have to be. If you're exceptional, that has to be the result of a comparison, not a prevention of comparison. I think some of the same actually goes on when we talk about the second kind of exceptionalism, which is Trump exceptionalism, the idea that Trump is entirely different from everything that happened before. This is a type of typical US amnesia. I think Mark pointed to that already, where everything that is in the moment, where we live very much in the moment and everything is as it has never been before. This election, of course, is the most important one in your lifetime. And that's probably true, but that was true for every election in your lifetime before. So there's nothing exceptional about the fact that every election is exceptional. And indeed, this may have to do, again, with the fascination with the framers and the idea that what matters disproportionately, again, something that Mark mentioned, is the Constitution, not just the Constitution as it was written 200 years ago, because against that, there is no continuity where we can see something as being not exceptional. Everything gets measured against a standard from 200 years ago. This type of originalism and is the opposite, of course, of historical knowledge and leads to this kind of Trump exceptionalism, which is a national exceptionalism. And that, of course, raises the interesting question that I think in some way or other, all three of you addressed, which is what we're seeing a US normalcy, but US exceptionalism? That is, does Trump emerge from a long-term tradition that is in the US and just continue a certain type of US exceptionalism? Is it perhaps the opposite, that Trump, by deviating from a high ideal of US constitutionalism and liberalism, is now joining the rest of the world in some kind of global populism, etc.? Is this indeed a dual exceptionalism in which Trump is exceptional both within the US and internationally? Or finally, shocking, is this maybe not so exceptional in both regards after all? Should it be just put in comparative perspective? Let me raise some of these issues very briefly with each of the three papers. Mark presents what I think is a very, very plausible story of US exceptionalism and Trump really emerging from a type of right-wing populism that he places at the very founding of the United States. And which I think he sees in a certain love of the Constitution, a certain role of the institutions as protecting this type of right-wing populism, including, of course, the courts. And I think that is probably correct, but I also would want Mark to be more comparative in actually making that point. And if I say more comparative, I mean also more comparative for the now time and not just for the founding. So he says, takes over Hartz's thesis that the United States, unlike states in Europe, etc., did not have to overcome strong forces like the church, etc. And so in that sense, did not have to build up or take on a strong state to overcome those forces. I think that's possible, but I would want to see that compared to all other states who have had some kinds of revolutions and revolutionary constitutions that had to overcome strong forces that existed before. The French Revolution certainly had to overcome strong forces before, one of those being, of course, the church, but others as well. Germany starts with a very revolutionary constitution that has to do a lot of new things. Eastern European constitutions do some of the same. And of course, the South African constitution, the darling of all liberal legal constitutionalism, does something of the same. So the thesis that a strong state was not necessary in the United States because of the revolutionary situation seems to me plausible, but I'm not yet sure how it, I would like it refined at least. What I can see is, and I think maybe that is his thesis, that everywhere else there was a state already. And so the state had to be taken over, whereas in the United States, it really had to be built from scratch. But I'm not sure whether that's his thesis or not. And maybe he can clarify in a moment. He also talks about the love for the Constitution. And there, again, I think I would like him to be more precise, because of course, a certain love of the Constitution exists everywhere else. Or not everywhere else, but in many other states as well. He himself names that, and let me see if I can read my notes, the thickened, progressive, cosmopolitan, constitutional democracy, is that right? I'm so sorry. A kind of liberal ideal that is understood to be the Constitution. And that seems right to me, at least from the German perspective. Almost every argument becomes a constitutional argument at some stage. In that sense, much like the United States, the difference is that only the United States has a particular originalist take. So the love for the Constitution is the love for the almost holy book that is the Constitution, as a comparative lawyer once called it. So it's a specific love for the Constitution as text, as opposed to a love for the Constitution as living document, perhaps, that seems characteristic for the United States. And so my question to Mark would really be, what then is more specified? Is it that creates this US exceptionalism today, not necessarily at the time of the framing, or to what extent does the situation from the framing still define the situation today? My sense is that the United States, in that sense, perhaps unlike other nations, constantly understands itself as constantly having to redefine itself. In that sense, not having a deep foundation other than indeed the social contract that comes in the Constitution. And that becomes renegotiated time and time again. And that tends to break down the moment that this social contract no longer is being ignored by a significant part of the country. And there's nothing else to go back to. I'm not sure if that would be his answer, but that would be my question to him at least. Kim and David, let me see in my notes here again. That's seems absolutely correct to me to identify this as executive underreach, and thereby something that constitutionalists are rarely attuned to. I myself have written something about the liberal impulse to always try to reduce governmental policies, and rarely to realize that actually sometimes government has to do more than it does. Where I wonder is if this is actually strategy or just incompetence. It seems in the Trump case, and actually in the Boris Johnson case, to be less strategy and more just utter thorough incompetence, which leads to the further point, which is Miguel's point. How can it be that big and wealthy and educated countries elect people who are completely incompetent? Why is it that the electorate prefers a clown over someone who actually would get things done? But my question to them really is one that has to do with another comparison that they make. The Brazil story that was in the news today about the police finding money between a high politician's buttocks that still had feces sticking to it, just for mentions of time. I apologize for that. The question is really unrelated to that, but it is comparative too. You point out, I think quite correctly, the anti-democratism of underreaching in the US, the populism here, and the overreaching in Orban and Hungary, which is equally meant to destroy certain elements of prior consent. And so my question is the issue one of underreach versus overreach, or is it not much more simply one between good policy and bad policy, or good governance and bad governance? And possibly the hypothesis is the difference one between a government willing to learn in new situations and one unwilling to learn so. I'll try to say something briefly about Miguel's points, all three of which, democracy, presidentialism, and constitutionalism, seem quite correct to me, with the slight question how Boris Johnson in the UK system actually made it to power. But my question, and because Miguel raised the issue of how do we get over this situation, is one about causal error. So you talk about institutions here and how institutions may or may not create certain problematic situations. And my question is it indeed the institutions that create a culture that ultimately may or may not lead to decline? Or is it a certain culture, and I think that was to some extent Mark's point, that creates institutions in turn that lead to decline? Or do we have some type of parallel development in there? I see Mark already raising his hand, and I'm sure he'll get back to that. So in the end, let me come back to my Corona introduction, and then I'll stop. asked these three questions from all three of you, all of which are asking you to put the US more in comparison maybe, or into different type of comparison than you've done so far. My urge in general, at least, and now come back to the pandemic argument, is first, how would we do comparative law beyond a focus on the US versus the rest, which is implicit both in endorsing US exceptionalism and in criticizing US exceptionalism. And indeed, secondly, perhaps also to move beyond questions, is this intrinsically different or is this intrinsically similar? And maybe engage more in the small small issue comparison, where we find, as we do everywhere in comparative law, some similarities and some differences. I'll stop there. Mark's suggestion that I see is exactly what I was going to do. That is, ask again the participants here to ask questions, ideally chat me up. We'll collect those and then I'll give the word to all of the speakers in reverse order. That is starting with Miguel and then Kim, then David, and then Mark. I have a question from Tim. I'll let you start and everyone else has a chance to think if they have a question and mention that to me in the chat. Tim. Tim Sellers.
Bit inadept at these techniques.
That's good.
Question. The question, I suppose, is this: the title of the panel was "The Demise of American Exceptionalism," and my question is, what died? What was different about the United States that has become the same?
That was even shorter than it was in the chat. Do you want to give 2 or 3 more sentences, Tim? With your mic on.
To speak.
Can't hear you, Tim.
According to, can you not hear me?
Yeah.
Rest.
Now we can.
Okay. Well, I would have supposed that American exceptionalism probably was meant, as I used it, or as it was once used, American exceptionalism was the American tendency to be united around certain liberal ideals. And that's what made us different from other places. We never had an ancien regime, at least since the Second World War. We were unified around a liberal conception of government that's embodied in our Constitution. So that I'm just suggesting a possibility, but others, you may have different ideas of what was once exceptional and what's now different. Or that's the question.
Thanks, Tim. I have no more questions from the audience. I'm happy to allow anyone who has a question to chime in a moment, but I will give the word. I said in reverse order, and maybe indeed I'll do that, to give everyone a chance of the speakers also to ask questions from each other, also to respond to my questions, or to just say what you want to say. And just, yeah, okay, do it so we end in time. Miguel, you start.
Sure. Yeah, so very quickly. So I appreciate Tim's question, which is like, why haven't we answered the question, right, the whole panel? And I mean, I think and this ties in very nicely to Ralph's points, right? We kind of distinguish between 2 kinds of exceptionalism, right? One of which is, I love the first one, right? Which is, why is the U.S. any different from other nations, right? Every nation is exceptional, right? So I think that's a really good point to begin. But the thing about Trump, I don't think he's exceptional at all. And this actually relates back to Tim's question as well. Is here's what's really, to me, this is the big puzzle, right? He is a populist, right? And the thing that's interesting about populists is how little different they are around the globe. They have a very similar program, right? They attack expertise, right? They divide the nation between the true people and I guess the faux people. They normalize emergencies, right? And they employ incredibly similar rhetoric. And one of my favorite lines is from Getúlio Vargas, who at different times was both the dictator and the president of Brazil, who said, you know what? for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law, right? That's the populist program. That's the question. Why is it that that the United States, right, the framers were worried about demagogues, right? They were worried about these kinds of problems. Why does it happen here? So Trump is not that different from the model around the world. He's quite different from presidents in the United States. I also want to address Ralph's point, because I think Ralph's point's great. One of the things that was bothering me, I'm surprised Kim hasn't asked me that question as well, is what about Boris Johnson, right? Or what about Berlusconi? So let me talk about how I think they fit in. I think Berlusconi, I'm going to start even talk about Berlusconi, we'll talk about him as well, it's more expensive, it's more difficult, right, for an outsider to take power in a parliamentary system, because they have to start by actually building a party. They can't just simply run for power the way that you can for a president. And Berlusconi had one, maybe two things that Trump lacked, right? One was money, wealth, and the other is he had real organizational talent to build a party. Donald Trump doesn't have the attention span to do something like that. Boris Johnson's a great example. But you know what? At the end of the day, he is a creature of the conservative party. He's not willing to blow up everything. I think it brings up a point that actually that David brings up in a lot of his scholarship, which is that yes, heads of governments, when they want to get things done, they will blow up conventions, and boards certainly has. That is normal. Anytime he changed the meaning of the Constitution, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make Brexit. In that sense, he was not any different from the framers, right, of the American Constitution. But he is not anywhere near blowing up. He's quite different, right, from Donald Trump, who is willing to blow up huge amounts of the institutions of the American government in ways that Boris Johnson is not. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Miguel. Kim.
Yeah, so I think
again, whoever has a question, throw that in, please.
Yeah, so I think that, let me start with Tim's question and back into Ralph's observations. So, I think that what many Americans would have said, and what many international observers would have said about the US, is that and they would have said it about the UK too, and it's equally wrong about the UK, which is these are longstanding kind of flexible constitutional systems, that tend to bend and they adjust, but they don't break. And that when Trump was elected, a lot of people were saying, well, this is a disaster from a policy perspective. This goes to the good, bad question that sort of Ralf raised. But I think that many people thought that the constitutional system here, and also in the UK with Johnson and with the whole strains that Brexit had put on it, would more or less survive, a little battered, but kind of intact. And I think that a lot of us believe, some of us who've studied the rest of the world were never that confident about the United States, but I think that even people who started this whole, Trump era, believing that the US, would come out of it a little battered, but mostly intact, are now beginning to wonder about that. And you start seeing a growing number of commentators who are saying, if Trump is reelected, all bets are off. And part of it, and this underreach is, I think, a big chunk of what constitutionalists, certainly I hadn't really thought about. What happens if a president treats his presidency like a game show, right? Where he just enjoys watching the governors scramble for PPE or throwing out challenges or, doing whatever. And so this is why I don't think it's exactly incompetence. I do think that Trump wouldn't have the foggiest idea what to do, but, somebody who was a little more institutionally adept would have at least not let go of all their advisors who would have been able to do it for them if they failed. So, what Trump has been doing is systematically destroying all the institutions that could step in and do something. He's destroyed the continuity that tends to hold up other incompetent presidents. And he seems to relish, just this constant, how many of us are just exhausted from the news, And so it's just a kind of a circus that you have, where you have the feeling that constitutional government itself is really in danger because of the strain this has put on institutions. So in that sense, it just seems to me, since I followed this in Hungary, for, quite a while before it happened here, and since I followed this in other parts of the world, I was never so confident about the US system. But now I feel like I'm not alone. And that's what's changed about American exceptionalism. Thanks.
But let me push you a little on that. mean, I was among those, and I think it was foreigners mainly who, when Trump was elected, thought this is going to end badly. Although we all thought it ends in the way in which our own countries ended. So I saw the Reichstag burning. People from Italy said this is Berlusconi. People from Turkey said this is Erdogan.
There's still time.
It ended up. No, it's been pretty successful. I agree with you. But I mean, and that goes to the Trump exceptionalism question still. He's an idiot, right? He's stupid. He is not. He has certain abilities, but not that many. He has been able to survive bankruptcies through luck. He is going to go out of this presidency either now, or let's hope, or in 4 years, and then end up bankrupt, etc. But we glorify him. We treat him as something incredibly exceptional. The same, of course, happened with Hitler for some time, right? Who otherwise is not comparable. But Hitler was also not as smart, not as brilliant as he made himself and as he was made. So the question would be to move away from saying what is so exceptional about Trump, it seems to me, to understanding what is it about, say, the US system in this case, that it breaks down so easily in the face of a narcissistic, stupid, uninterested, and incapable person who happens through various ways to end up in the presidency. So to make this less about Trump and more about democracy at large, or constitutionalism at large.
Yeah, well, I think that what we've underestimated, I mean, Trump may be really bad and stupid and idiotic at governing, but he's a game show host, right? I mean, he's someone who knows how to command all the cameras. And in a large, messy democracy, that may be enough to capture government, right? Which is to say that, you know, if you start firing everybody, destroying all the expertise, and just, you know, that is, how to put it, I guess I don't think that Trump should be underestimated. I mean, for all the reasons that have to do with why it is that he hasn't lost more support. So, you know, what I think is really kind of worth a look, though, is that Americans were inclined to believe that their institutions were stronger than I think they've turned out to be. And in this way, Trump reminds me very much of Orban, who sort of figured out where were all the weak spots in the system, right? And Trump, I think, has learned that by being a bully, because so much relies on norms rather than hard legality, because so much relies on civic virtue or politeness or, you know, all these, I mean, those kinds of norms, that he can just blow right through them all. And then it turns out everybody still treats him as if the norm is real. You know, so he blows through the norm and everybody still doesn't want to, they still want to be polite. And so what's happened is that he's turned America's virtues against itself. And in that sense, he's very similar to Hitler, right? Who turns, you know, sort of German legality against itself. And that's actually something the US wasn't defended against, right? As somebody who just refuses to acknowledge the normativity of norms. And that, you know, the US, so that's one thing. The other thing I think that Trump has figured out that we all should have been much more on the alert about before, and this was what makes the US very different from most places except perhaps the UK, is that most of the law of the US executive branch is contained in secret memos in the White House counsel's office and in the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, because it's so hard to get to challenge exercises of executive power in the courts here, hard to get standing, that most of what governs the executive branch turns out to be secret law. So, you know, when Trump's folks did not show up to take the briefing from the White House counsel's office, it set off alarm bells, not only in the Obama team that had prepared to train them, but in the Bush team that had trained the Obama team, and so on back the line, which is to say, this is how we maintain the continuity and legality of the executive branch, is through these briefings in the secret law that comes out of the White House counsel's office. And the Trump administration has never looked at the memos in the file cabinets, so to speak. So suddenly you realize that if you're just bound by what is the public side of the law constraining the executive branch, it's not much constraint. And so this kind of casualness and flexibility of the American system, which had been probably in many ways one of its virtues in the past, has been flipped against itself, so that now Trump will say, emoluments, what are those? You know, and then my friends who've worked in the White House counsel's office tells me there's a memo about a llama in there. There's a memo about every single gift he could have gotten from someplace, right? And yet they're just acting like it's all not real because it's not legally binding.
So actually it's not so much, oh, we shouldn't underestimate Trump, but we shouldn't overestimate the norms and the Constitution in the US, right?
Well,
I'll just cut you off and pass to David just because we run out of time, although I'd love to talk with you forever.
The US relies on norms, and now we learn that's a mistake.
David, Jim, did you have a question? Also with your mic. Jim, we need your mic.
Yeah, excuse me. I wanted to pick up on an observation Miguel made, wondering about how exceptional our exceptionalism is and pointing to a kind of a global phenomenon. What interests me as a comparativist is what has happened to the end of history, what has happened to the New World Order. Why do we have Orban? Why do we have Erdogan? Why do we have Putin? So on, right down the line. I don't have to list the usual suspects. Is this just a coincidence? Is there an implicit conspiracy? Or speaking in pandemic terms, is there some sort of political virus? I suppose it's more of a sociological observation I'm getting at. And certainly not a constitutionalist orientation, given the variety of constitutions. But I think what is really interesting is this whole rise of, you can call it right-wing populism in one country, you can just call it flat out authoritarianism in another country. I wonder, is that too broad, or is that something that somebody wants to grapple with?
No, I think it's good. I'll continue with David first. Maybe he also has a response to that. Maybe, and I'll let Miguel. You'll have the last word anyway, so you can just come back to that if you want. I'll get Mark in between, of course. I have you also on my list, of course.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I think that question.
So unfortunately, you all have.
I think that question is probably best put to Miguel, given his paper addressing some common trends that I think speak to it. I'll limit myself to a few quick observations because a lot of currents now. Ralf, I like your unexceptionalism of exceptionalism, frame or banality of exceptionalism observation about the way a lot of these comparative analyses work. On your question about is it how do you frame it, strategy versus incompetence when we see underreach like what we see from Trump? I guess if you understand incompetence, as I tend to, as a kind of breakdown in instrumental rationality, an end is chosen, but you just fail to get there. Then I think we don't have incompetence here with Trump so much as a more willful and strategic, in your language, underreach. I don't see him as actually having set clear goals around containing the coronavirus that have just not been well executed, so much as not even accepting basic premises about the threat and what it would take to begin to resolve it. So we tend to think about it in more in those terms. Also, I think to some extent, Ralf, your question maybe focuses too much on the person of Trump versus the presidency understood as an institution. There's a recent paper by Daphne Renan in the Columbia Law Review called "The President's Two Bodies," which gets at this nicely, which she says we're always kind of talking in two modes about the president. There's the individual, and then there's the office of the presidency. And I think a lot of the policymaking and the underreach, in this case, that comes out of this administration isn't just about the person of Trump, but the whole White House apparatus that is enabling him and failing to deal with the coronavirus. So if we expand the frame from Trump, the idiot, to his team, then we see a more, I think, clearly strategic and malevolent picture as against one of pure incompetence. On exceptionalism, I'll just say that it's interesting. I noted that Kim and I in our paper talk about how Bolsonaro's response to the coronavirus has tracked Trump's so faithfully. But then Kim came in and noted that, however, in Brazil, unlike in the US, you have judicial mechanisms to stimulate action more than you do in the US, so that Bolsonaro's order to wear a mask and lockdowns are effectively imposed by courts. At the same time, I think the further wrinkle to that, which qualifies that observation, is, but of course, Brazil's doing terribly also. It's not as if these judicial mechanisms have succeeded in reversing the executive underreach and getting Brazil to a good place. So one way to tell the story is one of difference, in Brazil having a kind of positive rights judicial enforcement culture that is better than ours. On the other hand, you could say that it's a bleak story of political and cultural factors swamping different formal differences in judicial approach, because Brazil is basically ending up in a similar place to us, the gutter. And finally, just because Mark comes after me, I'll take the opportunity to say one thing to Mark, which is I wasn't sure, Mark, about how to understand your claim, because you seem to say that Trump has inherited a populism-friendly constitutional order, and use a lot of language about how that's a function of the age of the U.S. Constitution and the circumstances of the founding. But isn't the more natural way to understand Trump's inheritance there just to do with the successes of movement conservatism since the 1970s and stocking the courts? And originalism, of course, is a political project that dates to the late 70s and 1980s. And so why isn't it more natural to say it's not that Trump inherited a populism-friendly constitutional regime because of something to do with that goes back to the founding, but rather just a more current and local story about he inherited a stacked judiciary and a kind of constitutional culture that was very right-leaning and very favorable to originalism and to populism trends because of the actions of Scalia. So Scalia as kind of agent of the change Trump builds on.
Thanks, David. Sorry to cut you. I propose, for those who are okay with it, that we go a little bit over our time, because I want to give Mark a chance to respond without having to cut himself too short.
Okay. First, thank you very, very much. One of the things Ralph's comments pointed out is I am a fake comparativist, or rather, there are people who do comparative because they wish to know something about, say, democracy, constitutionalism. And there are those of us who are Americanists who do comparative every now and then because we want to understand something more about the United States. And I'm always terrified whenever I talk about something other than the United States in the 19th century, that someone who actually knows something is going to say, oh God, that's stupid. So thank you for not phrasing it in that way. I actually rather agree with David. And the one thing I'm perfectly willing to say is constitutions written at different times, you can do different things with them. So my claim is not that Trump inherited a populist constitution, 1787. Indeed, I think that's absolutely false about 1787. But precisely because the Constitution was written in 1787, popular conservative movements, starting exactly when he says, could do things with it that you couldn't do had, in fact, Earl Warren and Lyndon Johnson written a new Constitution. So, for example, newer constitutions written by progressives say international law is our law. The framers also believe that, but they didn't write it down. That's something only newer constitutions do. And because they didn't write it down, it becomes possible for someone claiming to be an originalist to say, you see, that originalists are just like George Washington is just like me, and that there's something worth it for comparative sake. And I raise this almost as a question. If the Constitution is different because you're interpreting one 250 years old versus 25, well, sometimes you get to similar places, as I think Trump is getting to with, say, Boris Johnson, but you get there in different ways. The path is different. And sometimes it may be you can't get there from here. And it's interesting thinking about David and Kim's paper, that in fact, as Jonathan Jeanup has argued, and I've actually argued with respect to the post-Civil War amendments, the framers intended positive government. The framers of the 14th Amendment and 13th Amendment interpreted those amendments as a positive duty for the national government to provide the goods former slaves needed to be full American citizens. But given the court at that time, they never thought this would be judicially enforceable. And the result is, while I'll actually argue in terms of intentions, our Constitution is just as positive as anybody else's, newer constitutions were written with an overlay. We expect the judiciary to participate. This one wasn't. And again, because this one was written 150 years ago, and you can only find the framers' intentions buried in the congressional globe, it becomes possible for Richard Posner to say with a straight face, ours is one of negative rights. The 14th Amendment is negative rights, when that's not the 14th Amendment the framers wrote. With respect to Ralph's question, particularly directed to me, and I'll end on this line, I think the distinctive feature of American populist movements is that both the right and the left tend to be the standard form. The Constitution has been taken over by elite. We need to restore it in its pristine form. Now, it turns out its pristine form is always different. And so what American populists, and by the way, American progressives do, is redefine the Constitution. And it could possibly be, whereas other people call back to a mystical past when they create a constitution, we tend to call back to a mystical past when we interpret the Constitution.
Right, well, we actually have a few more minutes before we get kicked out of here. And so I want to answer Jim's question by bringing in David and Mark's, because they're both terrific, really provocative papers in thinking about populism. And by which I mean the following. Mark's right to point out that, so one of the keys to understanding populism, right, and this is where Originalism is really helpful, is that you aggrandize the power of the executive and you weaken the Congress, right? The Congress actually where we go to solve real problems. Aggrandize the power of the presidency like this, it feeds into the kind of problem that David and Kim were talking about, which is the logic of populism is you need an ineffective government that can't really solve problems, so you can make that kind of a claim. I alone can solve those kinds of problems. And so the regions of the world, and this is what's interesting about the United States, right? It's unusual for a country, a wealthy, long-standing democracy to elect a demagogue is deeply unusual. And so what I think about is the region in Latin America was very precocious, right, in having these sorts of populist presidents for some time, because they have such, deeply problematic governments. And so that has fueled that. If you, not just there, which region of the United States has been the best at developing populism? It's the South, right? It's the South under Jim Crow. Hard to imagine a more dysfunctional set of governments, and that's Jim Crow. And so this is what I worry about. The conversation is turning what we're going to do afterwards, and the conversation is going to turn to ways of, well, let's limit the president's power by effectively preventing Congress from delegating or something else. And that's not the real problem. The real problem is that the Congress of the United States is unable to solve basic collective action problems. That's what feeds populism, and we are not having a conversation about that. So,
thanks, Miguel.
Yeah.
Miguel, do you want to thank everyone as chair, or should I?
Oh yes, no, please, no. If I haven't already done so, thank you very much for agreeing to be on this. This was a lot of fun. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Special thanks to Ralf for just excellent comments. Really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely.
Thanks,
especially
everyone.
given the hour it is where you are, Ralf.
Right.
This is great. So
I've already had my wine for today, so it makes it easier.
Okay, well,
good evening, everyone.
Enjoy. Okay.
Bye.
Nice to see all of you. Thank you very much.
See you all.
Back to my Wisconsin conference.